Hi everyone, my name is Jaquelyn Jahn. Um, I am an incoming assistant professor at Drexel University Dornsife School of Public Health. I'm happy to be participating in this year's Inequality by the Numbers series. And today I'll be talking about the criminal legal system and its intersections with population health inequality. So I'll start by offering a super brief introduction to the criminal legal system, and then kind of working through a framework for how we might be able to understand linkages between the criminal legal system and population health inequities through a multi-level lens. And then I'll apply that framework to a research example on fatal police violence and community health. Okay, so just to start, I'll explain what I mean when I say criminal legal system. And I mean the institutions of law enforcement and punishment, as well as the policies that govern those institutions. So coming into contact with the criminal legal system could include being stopped by police, being charged with a criminal offense, having a member of your family experiencing one of those things, or being incarcerated, and the many complex processes in between. Previous Inequality by the Numbers workshops have talked about the criminal legal system, so I'm not going to go too much into detail here, but I do want to emphasize that in the US, under mass incarceration, these criminal legal institutions have an extensive reach into the lives of large swaths of the population. In 2021, around 1.8 million people were held in prisons and jails. And much of this talk will also focus on the racial inequity in those experiences. But as a social epidemiologist, I think it's not only important to understand the criminal legal system and how it works and how it affects communities, but specifically how it affects the health and health inequities within communities. Particularly because the criminal legal system is so pervasive and widespread, it enters the lives in individuals, families, and communities in unique ways, and there are a range of ways that it could potentially affect population health. As an example, I'll show you the racial inequities in drug use, drug arrests, and sentencing. And this is a particularly helpful example because problematic drug use is a public health problem, but it's also something that's criminalized. So survey data suggest that drug use rates are pretty consistent across racial groups. However, there is a disproportionality in who's criminalized for drug use. And this is a figure that the Vera Institute of Justice, Hinton, Henderson, and Reed also put together. And so in that leftmost column, you see that Black people make up 13% of the US population, but then moving over one column, they represent 15% of drug users, and they represent 15% of drug users in the past year. But drug possession and distribution arrests are disproportionately distributed. So Black people are 27% of those arrests. And then moving along in the criminal legal system, Black people are 31% and 38% of those sentenced to state and federal prison for drug-related offenses. And these trends are not only the result of disproportionate policing and disproportionality and criminalization, but they're also the result of racism and how problematic drug use is handled. Whether people receive needed drug treatment in the community or enter jails and prisons or institutions that weren't designed for therapeutic use, but are institutions of punishment, largely happens along racial lines because of racism. Only around 15% of Black people who report needing substance use disorder treatment actually receive it. Although broadly, I'll also say that receiving needed substance use disorder treatment is problematically low across the board in the US. And so behind this disproportionate criminalization across race is this broader force of structural racism. And structural racism manifests across many points in the criminal legal system. And therefore, we can't really talk about the criminal legal system without talking about structural racism. Many definitions of structural racism describe these interconnections between multiple institutions that reinforce racial hierarchy. And so G and Hicken offer what I think is a very useful metaphor for thinking through those interconnections. They describe them as a Buckminster fullerene, which is this molecule shown here. And so if we think about those different nodes or red dots in the figure, they represent different institutions where racism is reinforced. And there are importantly strong linkages across those institutions. And it's those linkages across institutions that make the molecule and make structural racism so strong, persistent, and enduring. So for example, in the criminal legal system, structural racism manifests in criminal law. You might be familiar with a law that issued harsher sentencing for crack versus powdered cocaine offenses, which was itself shaped by a widespread cultural racism both in understanding which types of drug use constitute something that should be criminalized more harshly, but also more fundamentally, racism in who is considered criminal. And then those criminal laws are enforced by police in the lives of individuals, families, and communities. So the result is a concentrated, because of racial residential segregation, surveillance of disproportionately surveillance of Black neighborhoods of people who use drugs. But also, as I'm saying there, that concentrated police surveillance is also the result of residential segregation, housing discrimination, and discrimination that's happening in the labor market. And so what I hope that you are getting from this example is the ways that all of these manifestations of structural racism really are reinforcing each other. But importantly, they're also entering people's lives unequally across different and intersecting with gender and other forms of marginalization. And so some of the research examples I'll show today help illustrate that too. And so to understand these linkages between structural racism, the criminal legal system, and population health equity, I find it very helpful to think about this through a multi-level lens, and specifically using eco-social theory and its focus on multi-level as a way to think through the criminal legal system. So starting with the individual, because of structural racism, 1 in 5 Black men with lower levels of education are incarcerated by their early 30s. This means that the health harms associated with incarceration are disproportionately concentrated among Black people with Black men specifically, with lower levels of education. And so those health harms, for example, could include mental and physical health harms associated with solitary confinement. And then when we think about the family level, parental incarceration is incredibly widespread. Survey respondents report over 80% of Black and Native American survey respondents in a nationally representative survey reported an immediate or an extended family member with a history of incarceration. And so a growing body of epidemiologic and public health and broader social science research has tried to understand what it means to have such a large experience among such a big part of the population. And for example, what could be the potential implications for adolescent health, adolescent development, economic stability across adolescence, childhood, and early adulthood. And then when we think about community exposure to the criminal legal system and the ways that the criminal legal system is racially and spatially concentrated, it's helpful to think at this sort of community level, which is actually notably understudied. But for example, there's a 4 times higher rate of incarceration in Black neighborhoods in Massachusetts compared to white neighborhoods. And it's at this contextual level or community level that I'll work through the research example today related to fatal police violence. Recent activist movements have brought renewed attention at a national level to police violence broadly, and specifically police violence as a public health crisis. And so if you are unfamiliar with that framing of why police violence might be considered a public health issue, consider that vital statistics or death certificates, birth certificates, recordings of, for example, infant mortality, all of their causes of mortality are a core function of public health. However, our public health data on our vital statistics data undercount incidents of deaths involving law enforcement or misattribute those causes of deaths. And so stepping in to fill this gap, citizen science initiatives have really improved the epidemiologic study of police violence by putting together databases documenting deaths that happen as a result of police interactions. So these databases largely are collected via public records, media reports, and are reported in real time since in the example of fatal encounters since 2013. And these data have allowed researchers for the first time to really estimate more accurate rates of fatal police violence. So Edwards, Lee, and Esposito estimated in 2019 that 1 in 1,000 Black men can expect to die of police violence over the course of their lifetime if the present rates of police violence hold. And at those present rates, police-related fatalities account for more deaths to Black men in their 20s than diabetes, flu or pneumonia, chronic respiratory disease, or these are cardiovascular disease, other sources of mortality. And the distribution across space or geography of these deaths really matters. It matters because identifying city-level heterogeneity in police violence helps policymakers, the public, and advocates identify where urgent action or where policy action needs to be taken. So it's sort of one of the benefits of thinking about a spatial perspective to this problem is sort of a national ranking of like where should fatal police violence enter the policy priority for different cities. And so with my colleague Gabe Schwartz, we designed a study to estimate rates of and racial inequities in fatal police violence. And to do so, we use the fatal encounters data that I mentioned and small area estimation techniques to map at the level of metropolitan statistical areas rates of fatal police violence. And so the first thing to note in this graph is that because these are only metropolitan statistical areas, there's a lot of gray space on the map. But we also found that 85% of incidents of police violence happened in these areas. And then you might see these sort of broad regional effects in fatal police violence with pretty high overall rates in the American Southwest, and by comparison, relatively low rates in the Northeast. Jacksonville, Alabama had the highest rate, followed by Farmington, New Mexico, and Bakersfield, California. But then when we thought not only about the overall rate, but the Black-white racial inequity in that rate, the map looks quite different. So where you saw in the Northeast, it was largely blue before, the Black-white racial inequity is the highest in the Northeast. But overall, the Black-white racial inequity was highest in Chicago, San Francisco, and New York. Those were the top 3 highest racial inequities. And in addition to thinking about Black-white racial inequities, in an ongoing extension to this work, we wanted to further understand how, whether it's helpful to think about disaggregating across ethnicity, specifically of Asian descendants of police violence. And so the current fatal encounters data and national vital statistics data don't disaggregate deaths by Asian ethnicity, despite a wide range of socioeconomic stratification and differing histories of immigration, geopolitical contact, and therefore likely differences in police contact within this very diverse racial group. And so you can see on this figure to the right, Asian Pacific Islander people, if we were to look at that as a racial group, had lower rates of fatal police violence relative to white, Hispanic, Black, and American Indian, Alaska Native, or Indigenous people on average across the population. But then what we did was to hand code and use other algorithms to try to fill in some of those missing ethnicities for Asian people. And at the regional level, we start to see some of the heterogeneity that is masked by this low on average estimate. So whereas rates among Southeast and Southeast Asian people are sort of close to that overall estimate, rates among Pacific Islanders were very close to, although with a quite wide confidence interval, rates among Black and Indigenous people. And so this work is currently under review, but broadly what we emphasize from this, our kind of preliminary findings, is that the overall rates across racial groups mask this wide heterogeneity, but also that our data systems and our active monitoring of these deaths need to also then catch up with these really differential effects and start to collect some of these data directly. And incidents of police violence not only are harmful to individuals who experience them and their families, but it's also important to understand how those deaths might have broader public health implications for the communities that they occur in. A core message in the activism around police violence has been related to what these state-sanctioned deaths signify for the devaluation of Black lives overall and the broad power of police in the US. And so another core extension of that work has been emphasizing just the emotional toll of police violence and how that emotional toll plays out in the lives of families and affects the mental health of Black people, specifically that live in areas after an incident of police violence, but also broadly across the country. But across the life course, there are particular moments across the life course when stress or acute stressors really matter for their health implications. And pregnancy is one of those sensitive periods across the life course. So stressful events and community violence during pregnancy, and especially exposure to those early on in pregnancy, can be detrimental to fetal development. And there is a pretty large body of epidemiologic research that suggests also that anticipatory stress, and that could include something like concerns over the prospect of a loved one having a violent interaction with police, have important implications for women's health and stress-related health responses. So for example, a recent fixed effects analysis by Friedman and colleagues found that Black women who were exposed to an incident of excessive police force in their Black group, so in a really small neighborhood definition, in the year prior to their pregnancy, were more likely to deliver preterm relative to pregnancies they had had when they weren't exposed to an incident of excessive police force in their Black group in the year prior to delivering. And so based on this kind of prior literature, I wanted to understand whether pregnancy loss increases after communities experience an incident of fatal police violence. And I used fatal encounters data, which I've mentioned, and national birth certificate data. And I aggregated up these monthly counts of births and deaths due to police violence in metro and micropolitan statistical areas. So the map that I showed earlier, and also some smaller areas as well. And then I used this distributed lag methodology to predict changes in live births after incidents of police violence, which are suggestive of a rise in lost pregnancies. And so this is actually a method I borrowed from environmental epidemiology. And previously, it's been used to understand how temporal fluctuation in air quality was then temporally associated with changes in the number of live births. So fewer live births then also suggests a rise in lost pregnancies, particularly when we can think about linking those pregnancies back to exposures that happen post-conception. And these models are particularly useful because they help address structural confounding. So confounders have to vary on a month-to-month basis because we also include area level fixed effects and seasonality adjustment, and insensitivity analyses adjust for crime. And so the results I'll present today, I'll present in a figure format. So the way to interpret those figures is on the x-axis, there's gestational month of exposure, and on the y-axis is the risk ratio, and risk ratios less than 1 suggest a decrease in live births, potentially indicating a rise in lost pregnancies. And I'll really focus on those first 6 gestational months because of this prior etiologic literature that suggests early on in pregnancy particularly matters for stressors and maternal and child health. And so I'll just show the race stratified results in the interest of time. But what we see on the left is that the association was null for births to white women. There's no change in the risk ratio across exposure for any gestational month. However, among births to Black women, those who were exposed to an incident of fatal police violence in their 5th and 6th gestational months were associated with a small, 0.29% decrease in births to Black women. And we also observed a similar decrease in live births to Latina and Asian women. And so what we took away from this study is that police violence and other forms of injury and violence are a public health problem, both as direct incidents of violence, but also have broad implications in the communities. And this is meaningful for addressing health department responses and also specifically city government responses to these problems. And particularly also because of the racial distribution in fatal police violence, and as well as the race-specific effects of incidents of fatal police violence, particularly on, in this research example, Black women and other women of color. Interventions to either mitigate the health harms of these experiences or to prevent police violence overall really need to explicitly address the inequity across race in police violence. And then taking kind of a broader step back, what I hope you take from this research example and also the framework I presented is that the criminal legal system in the US has pretty far-reaching implications for financial and emotional, and also physical health well-being. And given the vast scale of the criminal legal system in the US, inequalities in the system become amplified in other areas of life, especially including health. And to understand those processes of amplification and how structural racism drives that amplification, a multi-level framework is useful for thinking through what those implications are. Yeah, so thank you for listening, and feel free to reach out with any questions.